if you imagine sort of what are the pillars that hold up democracy, right? I believe journalism is one of those pillars. There are others we could talk about too, and they're all under attack right now. But if journalism is one of those, that pillar is being undermined, and people are attempting to, if not knock it over, at least replace it with these tech platforms that, again, have zero commitment to journalistic ethics. And I'm not talking about that in the abstract. I'm talking about the principles championed by, say, the Society of Professional Journalists, that journalism ultimately should challenge powerful positions, that journalism should serve the public interest, and that journalism should be transparent and factually sourced. And all these things are concerns that you all care about, that your listeners care about, but that the platforms that we're increasingly dependent on to receive news have zero commitment to.
Well, no, they're committed to keeping out points of view that are contrary to capital, because that's why they're hiring those types of people. They want those types of people there because that's how you're going to get the real lockdown on information, is to have intelligence people sitting there and scanning data. Like, I can't think of a better way to have a lockdown on what people are talking about. And the fact that it's us and Israel is, of course, not remotely surprising. And also further explains why me talking about deconstructing Zionism gets us stuck to the bottom of the pile.
It also speaks with a very heavy hand, because the one thing, and this is infinitely worse on the Democratic Party side than the Republican Party, at least as it's currently constructed, the Democratic Party has been making significant efforts to get people from the State Department essentially elected into positions of government, no more obvious than in the state of Michigan. And they're trying to get former CIA operative Alyssa Slotkin, who is in Congress right now, into the United States Senate. This is a problem that I have seen in numerous races, where they really are just trying to get all the spooks into positions of levers of power, because we are turning into a militarized police state. Partially, I think, because the average person now is starting to give up on this system. And once that starts to happen, they go one of two ways. Either the system changes or they force it to stay the way that it is through military action. But I don't know. I kind of get the impression that there's the night is going to be darkest before the dawn, and they may get a few of these people in. But the more obvious it becomes, the more I feel like people are going to band together and put differences aside and recognize that this is a class war, nothing more, as I like to say.
Well, it's interesting because there's a whole very serious and very carefully researched and documented kind of theories of the deep state that speak to some of those concerns, but that have now been basically discredited because that term has basically been weaponized, especially by, hate to even say his name, Donald Trump, right? But so there's a whole group of serious scholars who for decades now have been looking at that, and I think that that's an example of how concepts, like part of what we're talking about here is battle over the meaning and the application of different core concepts. So things like, what is the deep state, or what is freedom of speech, right? What does it mean to have religious freedom, right? These terms are the battlefields. And again, my training is as a sociologist, so what I'm interested in is how are the boundaries drawn, right, of what counts as legitimate, debatable positions, and what is, quote, beyond the pale, or what is so obviously so that it's beyond question, right? And the battles over these terms and how they work are in effect the battle lines in that definition of where are the zones of consensus, legitimate debate, and beyond the pale. And I think, yeah, so, I mean, going back to your point, I would say, what's troubling about that is there's supposed to be the checks and balances between the different branches of government. And those are it's an understatement to say those are eroded when you start having a kind of revolving door between the different branches. But, you know, we're pretty familiar at this point, without being cynical, with revolving doors between lobbyists and former government officials, and so forth and so on. So yeah, these are. I mean, I think this is a fateful year for American democracy, and of course, against the backdrop of an existential crisis in terms of the planet we live on.
Right. Well, which brings us to climate crisis and all other sorts of like shenanigans. And one thing that I thought, I mean, is interesting, but not because it was obvious to me, is, you know, we, like you were saying, everyone likes one disaster. So like we can all jump on what happened in East Palestine because it's one disaster. And then we all know that it gets old, and after a few weeks, nobody's paying attention to it anymore. But of course, that begs the question, which is what I like say is, for every rat you see, there's 50 you don't, which the real story is that most of these accidents have nothing to do with the transit portion of the chemical life. So that was one of the more interesting ones, but feel free to, you know, talk about some other aspect that you think, you know, is important there.
So yeah, you're talking about one of our stories this year is how the derailment furor in East Palestine, like the furor being the kind of around the clock coverage that eventually resulted from the train derailment in Ohio in February of last year, that produced amazing coverage from CNN and Fox. Amazing, maybe in a cautious sense of that term, right? It was intended to amaze us rather than inform us. But as Carrie Gillam reported for The Guardian shortly after that, based on research that was done by the Coalition to Prevent Chemical Disasters, between April of 2020 and February of 2023, there were some 470 toxic chemical releases in the United States. That's approximately one incident every 2 days. Most of those incidents occurred not on railways, as you were saying, but at facilities where these chemicals are either manufactured or stored. And the Government Accountability Office has estimated that there are about 12,000 of those facilities in this country, and that 200 million people are at regular risk to accidental exposure to dangerous chemicals because they live in proximity to those facilities. So this is another example of what I'm talking about, the contrast between what went wrong today, a train derailed in Ohio, right, in February, if we were talking in February of last year, a train derailed in Ohio and it devastated that community. And there's more to say about that specific story that didn't get corporate coverage as well. But what goes wrong every day, right? 200 million Americans exposed at regular risk, according to the GAO, of accidental exposure to dangerous chemicals. The kicker on that being, as The Guardian reported, that many of those people are people of color. Many of those communities are economically disadvantaged in one way or another. So it's people who have historically been marginalized facing the biggest brunt of this. The other element to this story that I have to add in, because I know it will resonate with your program and your audience, is the EPA has been trying to step up regulations on dangerous chemicals for some time. They've been thwarted consistently by industry lobbyists.
Oh.
So another untold part of this story is, you know, so there's a lot of distrust of government right now, right? And there would be a lot of Americans who would say, oh, the EPA, another government institution that's failed us and we cannot trust. And I wouldn't want to say, oh, well, we should give the EPA a total pass and let them off the hook. But the EPA is subject to the pressures of the US Chamber of Commerce, the American Chemistry Council, the American Petroleum Institute, these powerful lobbying organizations that will do everything in their power to thwart efforts to regulate those industries, even if that would result in greater public safety for 200 million Americans.
And I still think that that's the biggest disconnect with people on the right. And there is a very actively growing populist right movement in this country, whether, you know, obviously Trump has exacerbated the movement because they feel that he's a lightning rod for the movement. And in some ways he certainly is. not that I think Trump cares one way or the other. Trump's about Trump, but he knows how to play a crowd. That's his skill. He's a master marketeer. But with that being said, it's very real that a lot of people on the political right, the populist right, have identified the same problems we have. They are just not willing to go the route when it comes to saying that this is what's actually caused it. See, the government is corrupt. The EPA is corrupt. But why is that? Because corporate special interests have captured them. And debating any other capacity as to why that is the case is a non-starter and a waste of time. Either you admit the fact that the Koch brothers and George Soros and whoever other mega billionaire that's out there that you want to point the finger at and say is the reason for it, yeah, their interests are of their own and not of the people. And it is, there's a reason why we have a nonprofit industrial complex in this country.
That's true.
For the purpose of not paying taxes.
It's a whole other tax scheme.
That's like a whole other scheme that people just don't understand. And I'm only privy to this because I'm in commercial real estate. I'm in one of the 3 biggest industries in the country. And so by that measure, I'm able to see what the mindset is. And I've been in rooms with multimillionaires and even billionaires. And I can assure you that they don't fucking care about you and they never will. They care about themselves. And that is the end of the conversation. Now, if you're foolish enough to think that you're ever going to get to that level, okay, fine. There's nothing wrong with being encouraged to think you can succeed, because I think everybody in this country should have the right to succeed. But the way this country, especially today, is constructed, you can't succeed. It's designed so that you can't. So pretending that by some measure you're going to leap over all of these hurdles and somehow get to the top, they're not going to let it happen. So you have to realize that the system is broken, and it's broken because of the fact that corporate power has captured, and in the worst of it, the Environmental Protection Agency. They did once have a lot of value, but today they don't, because we're still debating whether or not we should allow hydraulic fracturing in this country.
Right. Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.